So good morning. Welcome everybody to the Sacramento Hospice Consortium's part 4, the final part of our 4-part series, Grief During a Pandemic. Today's session will be Grief During COVID-19 for the bereaved and those anticipating a loss. And our MC today is going to be Zach Woodard with the bereavement counselor at Sutter Carrot Home in Roseville. But before I turn over the program to him, I want to talk about just a few things real briefly. This is the last part. So what's up next? What's up next for the moment is we do have another 4-part series coming up that was supposed to be our annual conference in person. So instead, what we're doing it is we're breaking it into 90-minute sessions once a week for 4 weeks. Starting, I'm going to pull it up so I can look and give you the correct dates. October 29th will be our first session, and it'll go to November 19th. I'm going to send this out to anybody and everybody that's ever participated, so you'll have that information. We're calling it It's Time. It's about making the end of life a part of life, and we're going to have sessions on the different cultures and how they celebrate end of life and talk about it. We'll have one on self-care. Compassionate conversations. Where do we begin? How do we have those important conversations we need to have? And then what happens afterwards? Burial practices, different options that we have. So that's kind of a high level view, and we're hoping you'll all tap into it. Also, I'll be going out with a survey, asking you what resonated with you over this time together. What did you want to learn more about? What did you have further questions on? Because I know in a webinar format, it's hard to get that back and forth engagement. So watch for that in your email. And then finally, I want to thank our sponsors again. Sutter Carrot Home Roseville, Sutter Carrot Home Sacramento, and UC Davis Hospice. Without their generous support, in providing these and providing people that work within their organizations, this wouldn't be possible. So we super appreciate them. We also gladly accept donations, even though there's no charge for these. So if you are so moved, contact me or go to our website, sachospice.org. So that being said, I'm going to turn this now over to Zach, and he is going to take us through this today. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you, Brenda. And thank you everyone who's joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about how the pandemic has affected those who are grieving a loss, grieving a death, or those who are anticipating a loss. So in particular, in our experience, the people on our hospice program and their families. How has the pandemic affected them and during this period? And so today we have 3 grief counselors, Jane Ross, Julia Maris-Coots, and Karen Bolte, all from Sutter Carrot Home. We're going to be talking about their experiences these past few months. And first, we're going to start with Jane Ross. She's an LCSW and a bereavement counselor with our Sacramento branch. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, and I wanted to just get us started off, but how has your work as a grief counselor changed or shifted in these past few months since March, since the shelter in place?
Well, my work changed pretty much overnight. The week before the shelter in place was imposed in California, we were given a mandate by Sutter that we weren't able to use certain facilities. So immediately the group that I was going to facilitate the following week, the start of an 8-week group, had to be shifted. There was scrambling. At first I thought, oh, we'll just postpone it for a few weeks. When this is over, we'll start up again, and we all know where that went. So groups became virtual. The in-person individual sessions that I used to do are primarily now done by phone or virtually. With a few exceptions. If I have a client who's extremely hard of hearing, which I have one right now, I do meet in their home. Currently I'm wearing a clear plastic mask and working with him. We found that with the surgical mask, he did not understand. So we make adaptations like that. And then I've also made shifts. I'm doing more social work casework than I would normally do as a grief counselor, just because people's basic needs are not being met sometimes for seniors who are isolated and having difficulty getting services. So I've been adapting a lot to these conditions, and primarily now most of my work is done virtually with those few exceptions.
I see. So things have changed a lot.
A lot.
You
And
mentioned casework. What can you give me an example of what you're doing in terms of casework?
Yes, I have a client whose husband of 50 years died weeks before the shutdown, and she has so many needs. She's had difficulty with the finances, just figuring out, sorting through what her finances are, etc. So I've been able to, I've worked to try to set her up with community resources such as Senior Link and the Area Agency on Aging, but even those services have been very limited. So we've just had to really flex and try to get services. You know, Meals on Wheels was shut down for a period. We've learned to utilize the food program through the state that's an emergency program. So doing a lot of those things that normally would not be in my normal scope of practice as a grief counselor.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, with her, I'm doing very little grief work. And I've just made the decision that that's the right thing to do with her, that these basic needs are more important.
Right. Like it reminds me of like Maslow's pyramid, it sounds like.
Exactly. She needed food.
Right, right.
Yeah. And issues have happened with her air conditioning, with her phone. She lost cable service and had no access to a TV. I mean, things like this that her husband had typically taken care of.
Yeah, yeah, that's so sad. Yeah. Well, tell me more about how your clients have been experiencing, or not just your clients, but how has the pandemic affected your work and your clients and their experiences?
Well, the primary ways that things are different for them are things probably most of you have heard about or experienced, and that's they've had difficulty, if possibly the inability to even see their loved ones if they were in facilities or in the emergency room. That's one we hear a lot about now, that they weren't able to accompany their loved one into an emergency room setting. And then they end up working with us after the death with serious grief and guilt and regret about whether you know, if they had been there advocating for their loved one, whether the outcome might have been different and better. They're left wondering, did they know that I couldn't get to them? Why did they, you know, did they know why I wasn't there? Lots of unanswered questions, and we are dealing with all those now with our bereavement clients.
Yeah, that sounds heavy. Sounds like some heavy work. Yeah. Well, yeah, go ahead. Tell me more about what you had planned on preparing and talking about.
I thought I would just talk a little bit about what's different for grievers during the pandemic, as well as talking about common grief symptoms that people experience after the death of a loved one, because these common grief experiences that people experience with a death are actually things that most of us, including myself, are experiencing with this shutdown. So some of those common experiences, the most frequent one I hear with early grievers are poor concentration. They'll come in and say, I'm normally a functioning, efficient person, and I feel like I have air for brains. I walk into a room, I don't know why I'm here. I have difficulty concentrating. I used to read a lot. I can't even read a paragraph without being distracted, things like this. And that's not unlike what people are experiencing in the pandemic. Our worlds are rocked as well. Apathy is a common one, just feeling like nothing's any good. Nothing excites me. And again, depressed mood, we all know that's something that's
Right. As you're reading through the list, it sounds like a lot of my family and friends are experiencing these symptoms, even though they're not grieving a death.
Exactly. And to our audience, I would encourage you to post questions or share your own experiences, because we'd really like this to be a conversation. So please share any of your experiences that we have not addressed here. Let's see. So again, things that are common to both are loss of regular routines. The normal strategies we use for stress reduction are not available to us now in pandemic. Going to the gym is out, going to an in-person yoga class, an in-person session with your therapist, all these strategies we use for stress reduction and for coping are not available. Loss of in-person connections with friends and family, we know those are key and dominant in all of our lives. Many of us are experiencing essential losses, again, to that bottom of Maslow's needs. Housing, we maybe have a threat of housing loss, income loss, loss of childcare. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here. Yeah, okay, sorry, I had a little technical problem there. Loss of childcare. People are experiencing, having additional stressors such as adapting to remote work or having to work in high risk positions where they have fear of contagion.
Yeah.
Social isolation is an issue, especially for elders, but also people are saying, I wish I had a little time to myself. They've got too many family members in their house and they're all on top of each other. I've talked about a lot of negatives, but there have been some surprises in this. For the people that are grieving a death that I work with, a common thing that I've been hearing is it actually feels really good right now that the whole world has slowed down for me to grieve. This is something people pre-pandemic used to wish for. They would wish the world could just stop for a while till they could get their footing. And a lot of grievers are now actually experiencing that and saying it feels good that those around me are matching my own experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I've had that come up quite often. And then another plus has been people that have been laid off from their jobs, but still have promise of the job to return and have unemployment benefits. They've essentially been given a bereavement leave that they may have fought tooth and nail to get or may not have gotten. So that's been a plus that I've heard from a lot of clients that I work with.
Right.
And then I think lastly, maybe a silver lining that I've heard quite a bit is people that are grieving aren't feeling this pressure to socialize. It's common for people in early grief to have family members or friends that are saying, you got to get out, go to this party with me, let's go do something. And it's sometimes the last thing that someone in early grief wants to do. Oftentimes they feel like I just want to pull in and be in my cocoon for a while and preserve my energy. And so they are being allowed that without pressure. I had a client once that returned to work quite quickly after the death of her husband, and her supervisor, after 3 months after his death, said to her, "When are you going to be on your A game again?" And people aren't having that kind of pressure as much if they're not working.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah. So those are just a few things that I put together that observations and things that I've learned from my clients. I feel like the people I work with are my best teachers. And so I just tried to kind of hit some of the high points of things that I've observed that are the same and things that are different for grievers that are experiencing this pandemic right now. I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And I have a few follow-up questions for you, but I think I'm going to save them until the end for everybody to answer. And it looks like we got also another question from someone in the audience, and I'll save that until the end as well, because we might address it during our talk. But next, we're going to have Julia Maris-Coots from our Sacramento branch, Sutter Care at Home, LMFT, I believe, who's going to be sharing her experience. So Julia, how has your experience been, especially with the emotional responses that you've seen during this pandemic with your clients?
Thanks. Yeah, as Jane has covered a little bit, and as was talked about in our first consortium panel discussion, a wide array of feelings are a natural response to grief. And so it's common in any grief experience for lots of different feelings to percolate up. I'm finding that there are a few that are more predominant right now that are coming up more often during COVID. And so those are the ones that I'll highlight today. But just the caveat that I want to share is that, of course, there's no right or wrong to feelings. They just are. They occur. What can be important is how we hold them, what we do with them, and what we tell ourselves about them. So with that said, the first one that I find is coming up quite a bit is anger. And anger, of course, is a natural survival response, a response to a sense of threat, and it kind of activates our self-protective instincts. And often there's underlying more vulnerable feelings that are involved under that angry response, things like fear or anxiety, frustration, a sense of helplessness. Even emotional exhaustion can be part of what activates an angry response. During COVID, and people have a natural need to also focus that or direct anger in some direction. And so during COVID, what I'm finding is that that can be directed toward the disease itself, if the individual has been impacted or a family member has been impacted or is now impacted by COVID, is just the anger that there's this new virus that we still are learning so much about that they can't control. It can be directed at individuals, like in the medical field. Frustration with potentially conflicting information, and we've seen that in the news cycles, constantly learning more about the virus, and that becomes a source of frustration for folks, that maybe that information keeps shifting and things they had done initially to try to deal with it are now they're getting different recommendations. It could be at the government for a perceived lack of response or not enough response to the lack of equipment or like personal protective equipment, not being able to get a hold of masks or enough masks for personal use, those kinds of things. And anger, I've seen anger at the general public, folks who have been touched by COVID in one way or another and are frustrated and angry at folks in the community that they perceive are not taking appropriate precautions to keep this from spreading further. And anger can also there's a danger that anger can be focused inward. Folks can be angry at themselves for perceived lacks of judgment or problems that they may see themselves as having exacerbated in some way. So in the midst of all of that, it's important to have some ideas about how to manage anger, what to do with it. And so the first thing to do is just to identify that is what's going on, and to see if you can dig a little deeper to see what is that underlying source of vulnerability. Is it fear? Is it the helplessness? What might that be? And then find a way to express that in a productive fashion. So it could be finding a good friend, calling somebody just to vent a little bit. It could be some people write in journals, or they write letters to the person, if it's a person that they're angry at, as a way of trying to get that out before they actually speak to that person in any way. It could be something creative, something artistic can be helpful as well. So finding some way to express it. And then if action is needed, it's always helpful to take a cool down period. If there is a person or an entity that needs to be addressed for a perceived wrongdoing or an insult, injury of some kind, is to give yourself some time to regain your perspective. And if possible, kind of talk that through with a good friend or a confidant or a counselor about how you want to take action, how that's going to happen. And of course, compassion, self-compassion and compassion for others. One of the things that is continuing to come up again and again is this realization that everybody is impacted one way or another by this pandemic. And we never know what others are carrying with them in any given moment. So just trying to keep that in mind, that even as we struggle individually, others are having their own struggles as well. So trying to keep that sense of compassion for self and others as part of the picture. So that's the anger piece.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to comment, anger, and you have mentioned this, but I've noticed a lot of anger relationally, even between family members and friends, because people are making different decisions about how careful they are.
Yeah.
And that's been affecting some of my clients I know,
Yeah.
who either are expressing anger to someone or someone's expressing anger towards them, and trying to figure out how to handle those relationships now, when
Yeah.
they're at odds in their decisions of how to handle the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good observation. I'm seeing that as well. Yeah, that tendency to blame or be judgmental of what others are doing. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a hard one. Yeah. Thanks, Zach. The next one I just wanted to highlight is powerlessness. You know, that sense of helplessness, being defenseless, being out of control, or somehow maybe victimized. Those all elicit the sense of general powerlessness. And especially in a situation that's seen as being overwhelming and unchangeable. And certainly this pandemic is a good example of something overwhelming and unchangeable. None of us have any way to change the disease itself, other than taking what steps we feel are appropriate for keeping ourselves and others safe. Powerlessness can lead to, you know, if it lasts for an extended period of time, it can lead to despair, depression, anxiety, frustration, and even low self-esteem. Because when we're constantly in a situation that's undesirable, that's harmful, and we can't change it, that can lead to this sense of we see ourselves, we judge ourselves negatively for not being able to change it, even though that may not be rational. And during COVID, a lot of folks are, you know, again, because of the changing or conflicting information, that can exacerbate that sense of powerlessness, kind of get going on one track and then realize, well, maybe that's not the best tack, and now we have to reassess. There can be this fear, I think a lot of people have experienced it, of exposure themselves or exposing loved ones based on the work we have or what we're involved in. So that can foster a sense of powerlessness as well. And as Jane mentioned, people are often dealing with multiple other losses. And so when those kind of start piling on, there can be this sense of not being able to change that. Some hopelessness can start coming up, that sense of being out of control. And I would say one thing I'm finding is that this sense of powerlessness is being magnified by our social values in this culture, this predominant culture of being independent, being in control, taking care of business. So, and also that kind of general, especially political sense of divisiveness and blame can kind of add to that sense of overwhelm. Like there's just too much going on in any one point for people to cope with. So speaking of coping, what can help is, first of all, just acknowledge the feeling and realize that a sense of powerlessness does not mean weakness. It really does not mean that individuals are unable to take some kind of action to support themselves or others. To accept the personal limitations that are always present. We're all human. We can only do so much, especially with limited resources or information. And I came across a phrase, many of you may already be familiar with it recently, called "don't should on yourself." Try to avoid that self-judgment of I should have done this, I should have done that. That can add to that sense of overwhelm. And then focus on what you can do. You know, if there's particular people you can support, folks you can call, or steps you can take that help you feel like you are making some progress in your specific situation, that can be helpful as well. Then a couple of others that come up a lot in grief work anyway, but are, I think, more pronounced right now, are guilt and regret. Jane touched on these a little bit as well. I think it's important to make the distinction between the two, with guilt being a self-judgment for something done some action taken that caused harm in some way, and that in the moment of taking that action, there was an awareness that it was wrong. So an example could be in a moment of anger, blaming a medical worker for something that we know really they didn't cause, or that they couldn't change. Or in the last moments of life, to decide to take action other than what the patient had indicated they really wanted, because it rubs against our own personal values. So those are just a couple of examples that can come up at times that generate some guilt down the road. Unattended guilt can lead to depression, to chronic self-judgment, and to lowered self-esteem. So it's important to address it. And when it comes to guilt, what can be helpful is to, take responsibility where that's appropriate. To see if there's any reparations, any kinds of action that can be taken to mitigate any harm that was created or perceived to be created, and forgiveness of self for taking those actions, and seeking forgiveness of others for again any harm that was created. And it's important to note that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, or saying that you are okay, or you want others to be okay with this behavior, but it is a decision to stop carrying around the toxic emotions, the anger, the resentment that can kind of eat away at us over time and create other problems. So that's the guilt piece of it. And then regret is more looking back at a situation and telling ourselves, oh, I could have done this, should have done that. It's that shitting on ourselves. What if? And usually hindsight bias is involved. And what I mean by that is taking into consideration, as you think back, information you now have that was not available to you in the moment. And so it's kind of, it creates a situation. It's like a no-win situation. You're judging yourself on things that weren't present in the moment. So an unattended, that can also intensify general grief reactions, can make grief heavier and harder to work through. And it can also develop into guilt over time. Those shoulds, those coulds can become more fact rather than musings about what happened in the past. So again, to address those things, it can be helpful to, again, accept and acknowledge the feeling, to acknowledge that there was not total control over what was going on, and certainly that there was not an ability to see the future, to anticipate every possible consequence of choices made. And to recognize that people make the best choices, and I believe this, that people make the best choices they can in the moment with the resources and information available to them at the time. And that includes personal resources, like not being emotionally overwhelmed, or being emotionally overwhelmed may weigh into what happens as decisions are made for loved ones, or folks are contemplating a loss and figuring out how to deal with that. So again, no situation is ideal, and self-forgiveness and compassion can be really important when it comes to regrets as well.
I appreciate the distinction you make between regret and guilt. Can you give maybe an example, or maybe what's the most common regrets that your clients have?
Sure. A couple of common ones, Zach, and you've probably come across this, is folks who regret not being physically present in the moment that their loved one passed. Certainly that can come up a lot with COVID, because as Jane pointed out, people cannot be present if they're in a hospital situation, depending on what's going on. But certainly if they're exposed to COVID, it's just not an option. So there can be a lot of regret about that. Kind of their thought about what they had hoped would happen, kind of the ideal picture, and not being able to make that happen.
Right. In that situation, how would you distinguish that from guilt?
Well, again, I think that wasn't within their control. It's not something they decided to do. They didn't choose not to be present. They were told they could not be. So, and even in situations in home care where they are able to be with a loved one, but they had to go lay down for a few minutes, or they took a break to go get a meal. It's recognizing that they did not have knowledge ahead of time that was going to be the moment. So it's important to engage in self-care and to, again, allow yourself to be human, to know these situations are not ideal, and there's no way anybody can anticipate the exact moment that a loved one is going to finally cross that threshold.
Thank you.
You bet. And then just lastly and quickly, the last one is a phenomenon that's coming up called COVID envy. And there's a number of articles that have come out about that recently. And basically, this is folks yearning for things that they see others have during this pandemic, that they believe for themselves somehow makes the circumstances easier or better for these other people. There's lots of examples, like having others in the home instead of feeling lonely and isolated as the only one at home during the pandemic. Having support nearby where others, maybe family and friends, are at a distance. Having loved ones at home as opposed to in a facility where they can't visit them. I've heard this in grief work, a number of people have said, I'm just so happy, or not happy, but I'm grateful that my loved one died before the pandemic, that they don't have to deal with this, that we're not impacted by not being able to be with them. And others wishing that maybe they would be able to somehow turn the clock back and go through a death experience without the overlay of COVID. Having low risk work as opposed to high risk work, high exposure risk work, those kinds of things. And the list can go on. I mean, there's many, many potentials. This is another one where I feel that envy is magnified, particularly by social media, and the way social media gets used, that often kind of highlights the discrepancies that are in place right now between particularly wealth issues and folks who, again, are seeing folks who have access to resources they don't have access to, and feeling badly about that. And envy can lead to shame. I mean, it's not a feeling any of us like, and we're kind of, taught, so to speak, that it's a feeling to avoid, that it's negative. Again, it's a feeling. And given the circumstances, certainly there's some understanding. It's an understandable feeling that can come up. So trying not to judge yourself if this is something you're experiencing, or others, if you hear comments made that feel like they're directed toward you as a family member, or somebody who's caring for someone, that is blame, comes across as blame. For individuals, for all of us, I think it's important to examine our ideas about fairness. Fairness comes up a lot, as this isn't fair, it's not just. And that's absolutely true. I mean, none of us can control this pandemic. It's not fair. It's indiscriminate in how it impacts people, or who gets exposed in many ways. So fairness can be a difficult concept. It's not helpful to try to figure out how is this fair, because it's just not fair. So trying to avoid comparisons where you can, and focus on your own needs. So if you're noticing you're envious, so to speak, of somebody else, what does that indicate about what you're feeling you need? And is there a way to reach out for support, or some kind of help to meet that need in a way that is helpful to you? And then limit your exposure to things that might exacerbate it. So if you are a social media user, one recommendation I heard is, instead of being a scroller, guilty, and think about using social media to actively engage with other people, to really start conversations with friends, to have those kinds of conversations that are more helpful and constructive. And again, here comes compassion. really practicing compassion for self and for others, and to recognize this is an extraordinary and unprecedented time, and we're all muddling through. We're all doing the best we can to cope with it.
Thank you, Julia.
You bet.
Yeah. All right. Well, our last panelist is Karen Bolte. She's a grief counselor with Sutter Care at Home, but also a spiritual care counselor, and has history with us as a chaplain as well. And so, Karen, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I've been taking notes about what other people have been saying. Can you hear me okay, Zach?
Yes.
I'm having some trouble. Well, it probably isn't a surprise to anybody that a spiritual care professional would be focusing on meaning making. So just to introduce you a little bit to that concept, it's a concept propounded by in the late 1990s by psychology professor Robert Niemeyer and other grief experts. And what they're talking about is that reconstructing meaning from a loss is the central process of grieving. And that can be really it can be a different approach to COVID right now, and also to people who have lost a loved one. So Niemeyer considered that the person grieving not only withdraws psychic energy that's invested in the deceased, but also uses symbols of continuing bonds and then one's own grief experiences to reconstruct a new life, one that can be marked by enhanced personal growth. So that injects some hope in the situation. And another expert puts it this way, that reconstructing happens not only in how we adjust to the outer world without the deceased or something we've lost in our lives, but how we adjust in our inner world as well. So death or any loss of anything during COVID challenges our beliefs about the self. Self-definition, that's already been mentioned by Jane and by Julia. Self-definition, self-esteem. But I want to highlight self-efficacy, because that is the degree to which people feel they have some control over what happens to them. And I know that my colleagues have talked about that. But if you feel that COVID has crippled your control over your own life, there are a lot of can'ts, a lot of don't do this, don't do that, then that means that you're impacted at a deep existential level. And a psychological spiritual approach may help us gain perspective on our losses. So that's what I want to focus on right now. We're already familiar with the existential crises after losing someone or something, crisis of identity that Jane talked about, and roles that may be changing for us. What is my purpose? Caregivers have an especially difficult time with this, I've found, among my clients, because their entire lives were organized around the person they were caring for. At this point, I just want to mention briefly disenfranchised grief, and I'll come back to it later, but this happens when our culture doesn't recognize a loss is legitimate, so that it doesn't confer the status of a mourner on the person who's grieving. What this does is it isolates the person, who then often feels some shame and feels that they need to hide. So we'll talk about that in a minute. An example of that might be, though, let me just give you an example. Let's say you feel strongly about pets, as I do, and you lost a pet, and the people around you just don't understand why you care about something like that. Or perhaps a classic example is someone's having an affair, and the person they're having an affair with dies. So that's something that society really doesn't approve of, and you can't really share with anyone and process in the normal way. That having been said, many of the ways that COVID causes grief have already been discussed by my colleagues, so I'll skip over enumerating those, but I think it's empowering for us to be mindful of the unseen aspect of COVID grief. And it creates ongoing damage, and that is ambiguous loss. It's loss that occurs without clear understanding or without closure. In 2000 and 2001, Niemeyer wrote about the death and loss shaking our assumptive world. And I know that you've heard that before. We've probably mentioned it in previous consortium talks. But it means that which we value and believe as established through family, peer relationships, education, religious beliefs, have changed. So as an example, you bring a new dog into the family. Well, what you do is you let the dog explore and sniff every corner, and then that dog has to figure out where he or she fits in the placement of the social system of the new pack. And so when we humans are displaced, we revisit all these things too. And we ask soul-searching questions that we're all used to asking, such as, is the world a benevolent place? Am I being punished? Am I paying the price? Am I suffering karma? Many turn to religion, not only to make sense of where is my loved one now, or to continue bonds with the deceased, maybe through joining in their religious rituals or experience, but for ways to avoid or deny our fear of death. So I just want to touch on this because it's kind of interesting. This is what the American anthropologist Ernest Becker proposed in the late 1970s is the motivation for everything we do. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at that. Everything we do is to avoid the realization that our life will come to an end someday. William Worden, in his book Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, with which many of you are probably familiar, quoted a mother who lost her young son in the 1998 crash of the Pan Am Flight 103, and she said, "It's not how to find an answer, but how to live without one." And I find that during COVID, many of us are feeling, I'm feeling, that we just don't know how to live with things changing moment to moment, sometimes day to day, and there are no answers. So we just carry on the best we can. To review quickly some of the ways that our self has to navigate the ongoing change. These have already been mentioned, so I'll skip over them pretty quickly, but I do want to be comprehensive about it. A sense of self. It comes down to a routine. You know, we get ready, we put on ourselves in the morning. My husband used to say that, you know, he could see that the way I was dressing and how I was preparing myself, what I was gathering, told him, you know, what I was about to do for the day. I was kind of putting that persona on. Now, you know, I'm talking to you from my kitchen table, and, you know, what I'm wearing below the waist, you know, it doesn't really matter. I don't have to get into the car, go into the office, put on that professional demeanor. And so it affects our sense of self, our sense of time. I like to say the rhythm that we use to move through the day that feels familiar to us. Also through the week, you know, TGIF, we look forward to sports, certain things, the break of the week. The whole rhythm of our lives has changed. And what that's done is flatten the highs and lows. So it removes the dynamic quality of living. And I think, as Julia said, it just results in a general apathy. I call it kind of, I've lost my joie de vivre. So that's the theater person in me coming out, but it results in dysphoria. They also mentioned that, my colleagues did, a general sense of dissatisfaction with life. And when we judge our various responses to COVID as illegitimate, I want to go back to the disenfranchising point. What we're doing is we're really disenfranchising ourselves. So this results in a deep loneliness because we've socially distanced ourselves from ourselves. And for example, if I complain about masks and sequestering, and then I correct myself, I catch myself, oh, well, I'm feeling guilty because I should be grateful for all I have. There are so many other people who have so much more loss than I do. And then I think, oh, I should love myself too. And so I've already told myself that my feelings aren't legitimate. So I've disenfranchised myself. And when we don't experience our grief and validate it, that's when we get stuck. So if we also resist adapting to the changing world outside of ourselves, then what we've done is getting back to meaning making. We can't make meaning that we would use to reconstruct a new life and grow as a person. So we feel lost in the wreckage of life. There are tools that we can use for reconstructing. We can intentionally take time to reflect deeply in all of the ways that grief impacts us. And if you've ever been to a grief class or one of our series of grief groups, then you'll know that we talk about grief affecting us physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. My colleagues have already addressed many of the things that we can do to kind of make meaning in those areas of our lives. You can make body meaning by physically inhabiting your body. An energy worker I know who does Reiki says that to me all the time. You're out of your body, get into your body. Get in touch with your senses. Make mind meaning, and I'm making these terms up just to address these different aspects. You can engage in healthy self-talk to counteract COVID's many no's and can'ts. I can't do this, I can't do that. You can reframe using language. Yeah, there was a point I was going to make from what Julia said, and I forgot what it was, but the importance of language. Oh, it was something you said, Zach, about the difference. You asked a question about the difference between guilt and regret. And I remember having a conversation with you about how when we feel guilty about something, it's as if we're carrying that thing with us, as if we could affect a different change now. And when we use the word regret, we reframe it in a way so that it stays in the past where it belongs. And we can say, we really regret a choice we made, or those circumstances, we would choose to do it again if given the opportunity, but that opportunity is past. And I think you, Zach, helped me to frame it in that way. So we can also make emotional meaning. And I welcome us all to do a kind of life review. Usually our patients in hospice, at the end of life, they do a life review where they take stock of the meaning of their lives, who they were, they capture the value, and but we don't have to wait until that point. So I find that a lot of my clients are going back and they're thinking, here I am stuck at home. What are some of the things that I used to value? What are, there's piano playing, there's music making, there's spending time in nature. I have a man who is taken to remembering his wife by using her favorite colors to repaint pots. So he remembered then that he used to do stained glass work and construction work. So he's, I should say building. So he's going to revisit that and bring that meaning back into his life from his past.
Oh, neat.
And then let me go back to the video because I don't want to. Did you try to say something?
No, I was just saying that's a neat story.
Thanks. I'm trying to get through it in the time that we have left, but I have just a few more things to say. Do we have time for that, Zach?
Yeah, and you also have a question too. I don't know if you can see it. Maybe
I can't see it.
Okay. The person says, Karen, have you noticed any particular beliefs, spiritual, philosophical systems that seem to help their adherents grieve or cope with grief better than others?
That's interesting. I find that when somebody is, well, I can't point to any particular religion, but when someone has not been, I'll say this, when someone has not, before a death or before a loss, when they've not really taken the time to reflect on what they think about their existence besides being a physical person, you know, they hadn't really taken much time to consider their spiritual self. That that when these people are willing to do that and explore and consider, open themselves up for the first time, even if they start with the loved one that they lost and that person's religion or spiritual practice, that awakens in them an awareness that helps them in the grieving process, helps them in COVID also. And it really is, I think, as Julia said, the silver lining, maybe Jane, you said that, the silver lining is that now we're kind of in this place where a lot of what we can do, all we can do is just, you know, be in our heads in this, it can be a very bad neighborhood, but it can also be, allow us some time for reflection, and the world has slowed down a little bit for many of us so that we can take that time. I think that's a good question. I don't know if I answered the question. Yeah. I'm aware of the time, so I want to address making emotional meaning by, no, sorry, I already addressed that, making spirit meaning. So you may have become familiar with the quote from the 13th century Persian poet and Sufi master Rumi, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And it just dovetails on that question I just tried to address, tried to answer. It's appropriate in these times to ask questions like, where is God for me in these circumstances? Where do I feel new insight? Do I feel a need for new boundaries or new routines? Can I self-care a little bit better? Are there opportunities to experiment and play or give back to the world? And that brings me to one of my last points, generativity. It's the creative process that we use to incorporate the pain of the loss into our impact on the world. So this could be consulting your God, universe, higher self about how you might collaborate to make beauty from ashes. That's another phrase that Christians use sometimes. God makes beauty from ashes, and we can do the same thing. We have some very special volunteers on the topic of generativity who have taken our volunteer training and serve our hospice and patients and families in a tremendously meaningful way. And some of you may be out there and you know who you are. And if you're interested in that, you can ask any of the hospices represented by us speakers, but also the Hospice Consortium can help you match your talents with the right need. And if this inner work seems daunting to you, you can also enlist the help of a friendly grief counselor, a spiritual mentor, or a trusted friend or relative who knows you, knows what's wonderful about you, can remember your past, and help you to fashion a new way of being in the world. And my last point is, don't forget to give it to yourself. All of this is essentially self-care, and as a chaplain friend of mine told me, what do you need to do to stay in the roller coaster seat or to stay in the saddle as you adapt to all the changes around you? Do that for yourself because you're worth it. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. And it sounds like a good place to end, especially since it's 12 o'clock. I want to thank you, Karen and Jane and Julia, for all that you've shared. And thank you, everybody who's joined us. And if you have any other follow-up questions, you can always contact the Hospice Consortium, Sacramento Hospice Consortium. And I want to thank them for hosting this panel and any future panels that they host. I look forward to that as well. Thank you, and we will see you later.